Hello, and welcome to Helpful Think. Today we will be taking a look at a brief but comprehensive overview of common medical practices during the Middle Ages. As to be expected, the quality of medical care during this time was relatively poor. Individuals still believed that illness was a result of punishment from God. Nevertheless, secular approaches to curing conditions were continuing to progress. They often focused on treating the symptoms of a condition, rather than trying to determine the reason that symptoms were occurring. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Medical practitioners in the Middle Ages drew their evidence for practice from knowledge that was deeply rooted in Greek theories and tradition. These Greek theories came from Hippocrates, known as the father of modern medicine, who determined that the body was made up of four humours referring to chemical systems related to human behaviours. These four humours being yellow bile, phlegm, black bile, and red blood, and they were thought to be controlled by the four elements fire, water, earth, and air. Yellow bile was thought to be hot and dry, causing anger and irritability. Phlegm was in correspondence to wet and cold, causing a person to be calm and emotionless. Black bile was thought to be produced in the brain and was associated with a melancholy attitude. Red blood was associated with people with a friendly nature and enjoyed to joke and laugh. In these times, it was thought that the body could be purged of excess of any of these elements by bleeding, cupping, and leeching, which were medical practices that continued throughout the Middle Ages. Bleeding, or bloodletting, was done by a practitioner through nicking a patient in an area such as the forearm or neck with an instrument called a phlegm. This was thought to cure a variety of illnesses, from plague to epilepsy to gout. Cupping, which is still done today, was done through the application of heated glasses to the skin. The thought behind this action was that it would suck away toxins from the body up through the skin. This practice dates back to the ancient Egyptians and was thought to cure things such as menstrual imbalances, fever, pain, and weakened appetite. Leeching was a practice that was exactly what the name implies. Leeches were literally placed on the patient's body, as it was believed that leeches could rid the body of poisons in the blood. Leeches were commonly used on children or adults that could not withstand cupping. Most commonly, 3 or 4 leeches would be placed on a patient's body. However, medical historian Dr. Jock Murray reports that he has seen documented instances in which upwards of 90 leeches were applied to patients' bodies. Leeches would be placed directly on an inflamed area. For example, if a person had an earache, leeches would be placed on or around the ears. These forms of treatment were thought to be helpful because common conditions were thought to happen because of an excess of blood in the body. Aulus Galenus, also known as Galen, was a very influential part of medical theory from the Middle Ages up until the mid-17th century. The Greek concept of the four humours, as revised by Galen, was the basis of all diagnosis and treatment, but it had evolved into a theory of temperament, which accounted for psychological and social as well as physical characteristics. To gain a better understanding of different bodily functions, Galen performed both animal and human dissections. This allowed him to come to the realization that arteries carry blood, rather than previous theories that supposed arteries carried air. He described the 4 classic symptoms of inflammation, which were redness, pain, heat, and swelling. He also added much to the knowledge of infectious disease and pharmacology. Some of his most important work, which was successful due to the dissections he performed, was in the field of form and function of muscles and function in different areas of the spinal cord. He also provided a great basis of knowledge for diagnosis and prognosis. During 65 AD, a medical book written by Dioscorides entitled Materia Medica detailed medical uses and properties of over 600 different plants. Although the original text written by Dioscorides is lost, there are still surviving copies of his writings. It is well known that this text aided in the progression of medicine in the Middle Ages. Herbs, flowers, and perfumes formed a large part of everyday life in the Middle Ages and were inextricably linked with magic and medicine, so this idea was not a stretch to the common person. His writings were widely accepted by many, however, there was no experimentation done to prove that any of the information he provided was accurate or true, but we will get into reasons why it was believed to be true a bit later on in the video. Plants and their medicinal properties were used during this time in a way that they never had been before. Materia medica paved the way to form the basis of herbal medicine practices until the year 1500. Dioscorides attributed some plants to having multiple medicinal properties, while others were unique to helping one specific condition. People oftentimes would go to monasteries, which were known for helping to heal the sick, to obtain herbs from monastery gardens. Local witches or apothecaries would also create healing potions from herbs and plants listed in Dioscorides' book. Vapors and herb baths were often prescribed in accordance to certain conditions. Practitioners often instructed individuals to smoke the sick with fragrant woods and plants. Each flower, tree, and herb was thought to have its own individual, special qualities. Of all scents, the rose was most regarded and is most commonly associated with the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, monks and monasteries played a huge role in medical practices. Monks planted many different medicinal plants in their gardens and experimented on species described in classical texts. No monastic garden would have been complete without medicinal plants. Monasteries often developed these herb gardens specifically for their use in the production of herbal cures, and these medical ideas were still strongly believed. Monasteries were also the place to go for exorcisms. Monks even produced books including herbal remedies. Experimentation was never done to test the efficacy on any forms of herbal treatments in relation to certain ailments. If a certain herb was successful, it was thought that it was intended for such a purpose by God. As Origen, an early Christian theologian and biblical scholar, stated, "For those who are adorned with religion use physicians as servants of God, knowing that he himself assigned both herbs and other things to grow on the earth." Such interweaving of medicine and religion, of medical thought and theological considerations, is striking to consider in the medieval period. Herbs were also prescribed through the use of the doctrine of signatures. This is a philosophy that was shared by herbalists, which stated that herbs that resemble certain parts of the body can be used to treat ailments of that same body part. For example, the spotted leaves of lungwort, which was used for tuberculosis, bear a similarity to the lungs of a diseased patient. The Church during this time period provided a theological justification for the doctrine of signatures through reasoning that God had provided a natural form of alleviation for every illness. Whether it be an animal, vegetable, mineral, or herb, they carried a certain mark or signature. This idea is now, of course, regarded as superstition, since there is no scientific evidence to back up this theory. However, some people today find relevance in it and apply it to their lives. Some common herbal practices were sweet-smelling herbs such as rose, lavender, sage, and hay for ailments such as headaches and aching joints, henbane and hemlock for aching joints, coriander for fever reduction, wormwood, mint, and balm for stomach pains. Licorice and comfrey were even used for lung problems. Rudimentary cough syrups and medicinal drinks were also created and prescribed for respiratory issues, head colds, and chest aches. Vinegar was used to cleanse wounds and was thought to be a superb cleansing agent. Mint was used to treat venom and cleanse wounds, and myrrh was utilized as an antiseptic. During the 12th century, medical schools were on the rise throughout Europe. The School of Salerno in southern Italy, one of the most infamous of this time, was based in the dispensary of a monastery. It was the first of its kind and remains the most infamous of the time period. It indicates a more formal sort of training for medical practices. Physicians here were trained in the art of diagnosis. Observation, palpation, feeling of the pulse, and urine examination were key tools to medical practitioners in the Middle Ages. Manuscripts often depict practitioners with urine flasks held up to the light. Urinalysis was conducted and referred to the physician's experience with certain urine colors and their meanings. There were also charts that practitioners utilized to reference these urine colors and their meanings. For instance, urine with a reddish tint or blood in the urine was thought to indicate a broken vein at the back of the head, and gravel that, quote, betokeneth ache in spite of the stone in the reins. This condition, of course, is what we know today as kidney stones. Surgeries were also done, some even successfully. During this time period, surgery was considered a last resort. Amputations, cauterization, cataract removal, dental extraction, and trepanning were practiced. Even removal of cancerous breast lumps is reported during this time period. Surgeons even utilized opiates for anesthetic purposes and would douse wounds in wine as a form of antiseptic. Although precautions were taken, unfortunately the surgeons were often the cause for the demise of the patients. Even if patients were to survive surgery, they would often succumb to infections that were received during surgery. Surgical instruments were often rusty and unkempt, as people were not aware of the importance of cleanliness to prevent infection. However, during this time, a rudimentary scalpel as well as surgical knives that were a key part in the evolution of surgical instruments did emerge. Although formally educated doctors would grow to become more commonplace, people were still distrustful. After all, going to a local healer for ailments was all they had known. People even opted to continue going to midwives exclusively for childbirth and child ailments. During this time period, there was also a rise in hospitalization for the fatally sick and dying rather than remaining in the home. Common illnesses of the Middle Ages were leprosy, the plague or Black Death, and St. Anthony's fire. Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs, and bubonic plague produced the characteristic buboes. There was no cure for either form. Leprosy was a disfiguring disease, and sufferers were feared and exiled. Lepers were forced to live outside of town or carry a bell to warn people of their approach, as this condition was thought to be highly contagious. Lepers' squints were even used during this time to allow lepers to attend Mass. Squints, also known as hagioscopes, were tunnels in the church that lepers could access and see Mass without coming into direct contact with the congregation. Individuals with a condition known as St. Anthony's fire presented with burning extremities. This disease was caused by the ingestion of tainted rye, and as it progressed, limbs produced gangrene and fell off. There were some hospitals exclusively dedicated to treating this condition, where they would produce patients with a mixture of herbs. Amputations were also commonly performed at these hospitals. Many people of this time were, of course, still dying from much more commonplace conditions than those three that were previously mentioned. Women commonly died during childbirth or from postpartum conditions due to a lack of aftercare. The number of children that did not live to see adulthood was astronomical. Persons that worked in positions that required physical labor often died from work-related accidents, arthritis, and fractures. Kidney disease, dental problems, hemorrhoids, and heart disease would all have been common during this time period. Battle-related injuries were often fatal when inflicted. Medical practices have certainly come a long way since these times. It is miraculous to think that we are all alive during a time in which you do not have to die from something as simple as a fever, and no surgeons are trying to stick us with rusty tools. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please like and subscribe. If you did not, let me know what I can do better next time in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video. Cheers, mate.